We're now going to touch on root parameters, and these can be very, very helpful in building an application. Now, we're not going to dive too much into these. These are really well documented on the Slim documentation, but we're going to cover what you would most likely need for any application. So by a root parameter, I mean that when we define a root out, let's say this was /users and then / then the ID of the user. So let's imagine that this was some kind of user profile page. We would obviously have our closure in here, we would have our request, and we would have our response, so we can respond maybe with a view. Now in this case, we need to be able to pass anything through to the URL. So essentially we need almost like a wildcard. This can be anything, and then we can pick this up down here, look the user up in the database, perhaps by their username or their ID or whatever you're passing through, and then we render a view with that data. So very, very simply, rather than having to hard code this, which doesn't make much sense whatsoever, or rather than having to say come over to the browser and have something like ID equals 1, which you may have done before, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with doing this, but it's a lot better to obviously include this in the URL. What we'd actually do in this case is do a / and then inside of square brackets here, or curly braces, we just give the name of what we want this to be called. So in this case, it could be ID, it could be user ID, really it can be whatever you want here. And what you can actually do is continue to chain this on if you wanted to. So depending on how complex your URL structure is, you could pick up 2 different items in the URL if you wanted. So let's take a look at this example, because really we need to figure out how to even get this value inside of here. We know that we would look the user up in the database, so look user up in database, and then we would return a view in here. So how do we do this? We can't really do this with request, because it is kind of to do with the request, but it's not really the request's responsibility. The response obviously wouldn't make sense, but what we can now do is give a optional third parameter into our closure, and this is args. So let's go ahead and just do a var dump on args and just see how this looks with this new placeholder in here, or parameter in here, and this in the URL. Now you can see that we have the name of the parameter that we gave, or the placeholder that we gave, and of course the value. So obviously if I change this around, we get a new value in here. Now obviously what this means is, what we can then do is look the user up in the database by args and then the name that we've given. Now in this case, I'd probably call this ID, so then I would access it by args and then ID, since this is an array, and then I can just take that information that I've looked up in the database and I can go ahead and return a view. Now the only difference that you might find here, and there are lots of different complex patterns that we can use in URLs, but like I said, the most common are to do this. And of course, what you can do is also make this optional. You can make anything about this URL optional. So in our case, we might want to say, well, we want to define one root with /users, or we also want to perhaps have an ID. So essentially we're creating 2 different actions from one URL. Well, in that case, I can wrap this whole thing here inside of square brackets. And all this means now is if I provide the URL users, that will work. Or if I give an optional / and then the ID, that will work as well. So let's take a look at this, and why don't we just bring back that var dump just so we can see what we get inside of args. So if we come over to the browser, you can see this works as normal, but if I now get rid of this, we just see an empty array. So in this case, if this wasn't the case, like so, we can only really respond to this full URL and this full pattern, and of course this will now not work. So why might you want to do this? Well, if you're building up a RESTful route where maybe you had the ability to get users and then potentially get a user by their ID, what you might want to do, and I don't really like this, so I wouldn't really encourage this, is check if the args are empty, or rather if we have args ID set, then you might go ahead and return list of users here. Or you may check if it's not set. So this would be if you hadn't provided an ID. And then otherwise you would go ahead, or in this case you wouldn't have to do else because you would be returning here. You could go ahead and then return that particular user's ID. Now I don't really like this because I think it's a lot easier to just do this and then have a completely separate root like so, just for a list of users. It really makes things a little bit tidier. And once we get into looking at controllers, this will become even tidier as well. So let's take a look at an example of just taking something from here and just passing it down to a view. And we'll just kind of assume that we have a user back from our database. And we're just kind of reiterating what we did earlier, really just to kind of practice. So let's go ahead and say that we've looked the user up in the database, maybe using PDO, and we go ahead and get a user object back. We know that we can do that. This is exactly what we would do. We would probably have the ID in this record as well. And just for the sake of things, let's go ahead and set the ID to the value that we get back from here. And then we would have maybe a username, maybe an email, maybe a full name, whatever. So now what we would do is, again, we would return this view. We would render, pass through our response, choose the view. So in our case, let's create a very quick user profile view. So we could call this user.twig, or we could categorize this under a folder if we wanted to and call this profile. And then in here, let's just put an H1 and go ahead and output user.username. And then maybe next to this in brackets, we could go ahead and output their ID with a hash at the start. So in this case, it would be user.id. So there we go. That's what we would do. Pick them up in the database by the ID that we get using args, respond with that view like so. And of course, what we would do as part of this is pass the user down like this into the view. Now, just as a kind of side note, let's check this works first of all. So we would say users/1. We see that. Of course, if we were to change that, we just get a different value here. Now, again, like I just said, as a side note, what you can actually do instead of passing this array down is use the compact function in PHP. What this will allow you to do is take in, say, a variable like user, and this will actually allow you to do pretty much the same thing. You see it works in the same way. All this is doing here is it's saying, find me a variable called user and basically put this into an array to pass down. And you can kind of prove that by going ahead and doing a var dump on compact user, and you just see the array there with user in. So that is pretty much how you would do that with root parameters. Very, very useful. You'll probably use these a lot because obviously all of your URLs aren't all going to be static. You're going to need to pass something into these. And just remember, you can pretty much pass anything you want into here. So that will be available in that args array if there are multiple items. Just remember though that you couldn't do something like this and define out the ID again, because you would have a conflict with the same value. But that should be pretty much all you would need to go ahead and start to build up these kind of URLs. And of course, we'll be looking at examples like this later where we actually do go ahead and look things up in the database. So if this isn't entirely clear, then it will make a lot more sense later on.